Hi, I'm Kathy Rotundo. We decided over dinner one night with my nephew, Bob, decide to start recording some of the preparation of some of the family meals that we enjoy. And I decided to call the series It All Starts with the Breadcrumbs, because that was my very first recipe. It's also a metaphor for making sure that the basic ingredients of everything you're using are fresh. The very first recipe I ever got was for Italian breadcrumbs. We grew up in a house with a lot of kids, and food in our family meant some kind of roast, some kind of starch, and some kind of vegetable. So I was enamored with, absolutely fascinated with cutlets. I didn't have a chicken cutlet until I was 13 years old. And so, because we never had them in the house, that was the first recipe I wanted to prepare for my boyfriend. I was 15 years old, and I took myself off to the butcher shop to go buy chicken cutlets and everything I needed. And I was there, a butcher by the name of Vinny, my mother's butcher, was a really nice man, took pity on me, and insisted that when I went to get the box, it looks pretty much just like this, of dried breadcrumbs. He took me under his wing and said, "No, that's not what you want." And he handed me a bag pretty similar to something like this. It wasn't a Ziploc, but they had freshly prepared breadcrumbs on site. And he gave me the recipe for Italian breadcrumbs. And with that, here's my 15-year-old recipe for Italian breadcrumbs. With that, I'm going to show you exactly what we do. This technique was passed down to me by my mother-in-law, Catherine, whom I love and miss very much. At 15, 16 years old, she took me under her wing and taught me how to cook. Well, I shouldn't say taught me how to cook. She encouraged any kind of participation in the kitchen. And in our family, you didn't go in the kitchen. You know, a lot of little kids running around, you could lose a finger. Anyway, every night with dinner, we have some sort of Italian bread. And at the end of dinner, there's usually 1 or 2 nubs of bread left over that don't get eaten. Like this. Something like this. Just a regular nub of bread that, you know, you've eaten the bread, something's left over. You can actually use any kind of bread. We always use Italian bread because that's what we have. But if you have leftover bread from white bread or whole wheat bread, something that, you know, rather than throw it away, it's getting stale, you put it in a bowl. She used stainless steel. I use stainless steel. They pile up in the bowl 2 or 3 days. She lets them sit in the oven and they dry out. Then they go into the food processor. You pulse for a little bit, and then when they get nice and ground, you toast them up. One of the things you want to remember when you're reading a recipe is to check to make sure whether they want toasted breadcrumbs, which are dried breadcrumbs, or they want freshly made breadcrumbs. You can do it either way. Okay, so you have these nubs of bread left over. They sat for a little bit. They're just about dry. Okay, well, that is blessedly not my Cuisinart. My first Cuisinart was given to me as a gift by my husband on our first Christmas together. And it lasted me 21 years. Anyway, what I want to show you is the breadcrumbs. You see they're pretty rough. It's a very rough chop of a breadcrumb. But these, just this way, are the kind of breadcrumbs you would use if you were making meatballs, fresh meatballs. You don't really need to toast them. You want them to be moist. And that moisture helps keep the meatballs moist. You would even use these if you're making hamburgers, you know, just to keep the moisture in. Not a lot, just a little. That's another show on that. Anyway, so these then get put on a cookie tray, and you toast them in the oven till they get a little dry. They will look like this. And this has been my bag. This is my stash that I keep in the freezer at home. You see? Just like that. So, but back to the recipe. It's 1 part breadcrumbs, And this is a little bit more than a cup measure. I filled it all the way to the top. 1 part breadcrumbs, grated cheese is your next item. Now, a word about grated cheese. The best way, grate your own. Buy a block. We like to use Locatelli Romano because that's the brand that my mother-in-law used to use. Most Sicilians use Locatelli Romano. There's Pecorino Romano. We like to use Locatelli Romano. Also, a lot of people use the Parmesan for this. Romano was a little bit sharper, so we like that a little bit better. So that's what we use in our family. This is your first choice, to grate it yourself. Second choice, buy it fresh in the deli section, and you'll see Pecorino Romano grated cheese. Second best. What you absolutely don't want to do is to buy the green thing. This is disgusting. Not even really good cheese. Don't want that. All right, so you got the breadcrumbs. Next up, in terms of the proportion that he gave me for my very first recipe, well, that's changed because we start with what the original recipe was, and then you accommodate it. You know, over time, your taste changes. Things that you like are different. You really can smell the difference. All right, so we're going with, I don't know, 2/3 breadcrumbs, 1/3 cheese. And I'm good with that. You will, in the end, just learn from smell how good they are. Some of the balls are, you know, some of the cheese is a little bit balled up. You chop it up in there so that the balls mix in. And that's pretty much the basis of most things that you're going to bread. The new thing these days that you see on TV all the time is something called panko, which are Japanese breadcrumbs. And the Japanese breadcrumbs, believe it or not, are just very, very similar to the fresh breadcrumbs that I just showed you how to make from scratch. They're thicker. They're left more whole. These are pummeled a little bit more. They've gone through the food processor twice. And then here, you could also really just get in there and use your fingers. And I mean, this seems like it's a lot of work for just some breadcrumbs, but they go into so many different things. I mean, I use them for cutlets, I use them for eggplant parmesan, I use them in more things you could possibly want. Most recently, I started using them in zucchini Romano recipe that I hope to show you sometime real soon because it happens to be pretty delicious. Okay, the next up is your garlic. And I'm measuring now because I want to show you something. You know, this is a tablespoon measure. And again, our recipe isn't that exact, but this is, when you're baking, it's particularly important when you measure to make sure that you take the knife and cut it off at the top so that you get an exact measure. Now, in my case, I didn't care about that the stuff fell over and went into the bowl because I happen to like extra garlic. I'm just demonstrating that when you measure, you want to make sure it's flat at the top. So in goes your garlic powder. And this is where the recipe gets exciting. Here's onion powder. Same amount. Tablespoon, thereabouts. Depending also too, you know, I use the same breadcrumbs in just about every Italian preparation. But if you were going to use a dish and make breadcrumbs from scratch and do something, you know, in a Spanish style, you just make the Spanish style breadcrumbs. Okay, I'm going a little shy on the garlic powder because I'm not as big a fan of garlic powder as I am of the. Want some fresh pepper. Cheese is a little salty, so you don't want to use too much in the way of extra salt. Cheese is a little salty, so you want to go a little easy on the salt. Okay, so now here's what makes it. Not only do we have onion powder and garlic powder, and we're mixing that together nice and gently, but we also want to use some fresh parsley. In this case, I have dried parsley. And I want to say that's about a tablespoon of fresh parsley. Again, the measuring is not that important in a recipe like this. You're not baking. A little bit of oregano. And I say a little bit because you don't want it to overwhelm. It's less than a teaspoon. Maybe if you're going to have to measure something, it's about 1/8 of a teaspoon. And then finally, basil was, when I was hearing it all along, basilico. I found that very funny. Anyway, my mother-in-law would use fresh basil that she picked right from the garden. Back home, I'm growing basil myself. So I want to say that's about the amount you're looking for. Okay? And maybe a shake or two for good measure, because I really like basil. And that's it. We're going to mix it up. You want to thoroughly incorporate all of the herbs and spices into the breadcrumbs. It looks pretty. I can tell you that. I love it when I am using fresh parsley and fresh basil. I like to wear it right I put it right in the Cuisinart with the breadcrumbs so that it dries as the bread is grinding. So there you have it. I like to smell it. Actually, from the smell, I can tell it needs a little more cheese. Shaking out a tiny bit more cheese. Oh, I can't wait to get to the cutlets that I'm going to show you next. But in the meantime, this is your homemade breadcrumbs, and the crux of every single thing that we make in an Italian kitchen, it all starts with the breadcrumbs. Enjoy. Oh man, I can't wait to, they smell so good, I can't wait to use them.